In the quiet stillness of a small town, Sheriff Caleb stumbles upon a scene that will change his life forever. A young girl alone and vulnerable, sleeping in the back of an abandoned car. What begins as a routine patrol turns into a powerful journey of love, loss, and the unbreakable bond that forms between two souls searching for hope. Stay with us as we dive into this heartwarming story of second chances and the true meaning of family. If you're ready for a story that will move you, hit that like button and stay tuned. Sheriff Caleb Thompson had driven down the same winding roads that led to the outskirts of the town for years, but that afternoon, something was different. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the empty park. His patrol was routine, yet an uneasy feeling nagged at him as he passed through the deserted area. A car, parked just slightly off-kilter near the tree line, caught his attention. He stepped out of his cruiser, boots crunching against the gravel path, and approached the vehicle. The windows were slightly fogged from the chilly afternoon air, and inside, on the back seat, lay a small figure. A child. The soft rise and fall of her chest told Caleb that she was merely asleep, but the dirt-streaked cheeks and worn clothing revealed she had been here for some time. She looked fragile, her delicate appearance contrasting sharply with the pale upholstery of the car. As he stood there looking at the girl, something stirred deep within him. His mind flashed back to his own childhood, filled with cold nights and uncertainty. He remembered the loneliness he had once felt, the kind that settled in your bones and stayed there for years. The sheriff shook his head, trying to push away the memories. Now wasn't the time for that. He tapped gently on the window, trying not to startle her, but she didn't stir. Caleb hesitated. What was a child doing here all alone? Where were her parents? His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. His hand hovered over his radio, ready to call for backup, but something made him pause. He needed to handle this carefully. He slowly opened the door, the hinges creaking softly in the quiet afternoon, and crouched beside the car. "Hey there, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice gentle. "It's okay. You're safe now." The girl stirred slightly, but she didn't wake. Caleb stood and took a deep breath. He was no stranger to difficult situations, but this one felt different. There was something about this child that tugged at his heart. He would have to figure out what had led her to this lonely place. For now, all he could do was wait and hope that when she woke, she would tell him her story. The soft rustling of the leaves in the wind provided a calm backdrop, but the tension in Caleb's chest only grew heavier as the minutes passed. The girl began to stir, her eyes fluttering open, wide and filled with fear the moment they locked onto his. She shot upright, scrambling to the far corner of the back seat, pressing herself against the door. Hey, Caleb said, raising both hands, palms open, in a gesture of peace. "It's okay. You're safe. I'm not here to hurt you." Her wide eyes darted around, scanning the car, the park, and then finally focusing back on him. Her small body was shaking, and she hugged her knees tightly to her chest. Her lips trembled, but no words came out. Caleb crouched lower, keeping his distance. "My name's Caleb. I'm the sheriff around here. What's your name, sweetheart?" Silence. Her big brown eyes were watching him carefully, trying to gauge if he was a threat. She seemed to be weighing her options: run, scream, or just stay frozen in place. Caleb could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else, too. A deep sadness, one he recognized from his own reflection in the mirror when he was a boy. The sun had dipped lower, and the temperature was dropping fast. He needed to get her inside somewhere warm. He kept his voice low and soft. "You don't have to say anything, okay? But you're cold. Why don't we head back to the station, and I'll find you something warm to eat. You don't have to talk if you don't want to." The girl blinked at him, her face betraying the hunger she was likely feeling. Caleb slowly extended his hand toward her, not to touch her, but as an invitation. "I'm not going to hurt you. Promise." The silence stretched between them for what felt like an eternity before she finally hesitantly, reached out and placed her tiny hand in his. Her fingers were ice cold. Caleb helped her out of the car, her bare feet hitting the gravel path with a soft crunch. She was small, so much smaller than any child her age should be. Caleb led her to his patrol car, opening the back door. "What's your name?" he asked again as she slid onto the seat. This time, a whisper so soft it was almost swallowed by the wind escaped her lips. "Maya." He nodded, relieved she was finally opening up even just a little. "Okay, Maya, let's get you someplace safe." The ride back to the station was quiet, the hum of the engine filling the space between them. Maya stared out the window, lost in thought. Caleb glanced at her through the rearview mirror every few minutes, trying to figure out how to approach the situation. His mind raced with questions. Why had she been alone? Where were her parents? What had driven her to hide in that car? As they pulled into the small, quiet station, Caleb parked and turned around to face her. "Maya, we're going inside. There's food, water, and a place to rest. No one's going to bother you here. You can trust me." Maya looked at him for a moment before nodding, just barely, and followed him into the building. Caleb quickly got her a blanket and a cup of warm cocoa, which she held tightly in her hands, but didn't drink. He didn't push her to talk, sensing that trust would take time. Sitting across from her, he waited. Minutes passed, and she said nothing. The silence felt heavy, but Caleb knew better than to rush her. He saw the scars in her eyes, scars that took a lifetime to heal. But there was a flicker of hope, too, and that was what he clung to. If she could trust him, even a little, maybe he could help her out of whatever darkness she was in. But for now, all he could do was sit in silence, waiting for the moment she would feel safe enough to tell him the truth. Hours passed, and Caleb kept himself busy around the station, trying to give Maya some space. He checked on her occasionally, offering her food and a place to rest, but she remained silent, curled up on the small couch in the corner, the blanket pulled tight around her. Her eyes were hollow, distant, as if she were still somewhere far away, lost in thoughts or memories she couldn't escape. Caleb found himself glancing at the clock. It was getting late, and he knew she needed more than just shelter. He decided to try again, but this time, he'd approach things differently. He grabbed a chair, sat down in front of her, and spoke softly, careful not to push her too hard. "You know, Maya, when I was a kid, I used to run away sometimes. Life at home wasn't easy." He began, his eyes on the floor. "My mom, she did her best, but my dad wasn't around much, and when things got bad." He paused, feeling the weight of his own memories pressing down on him. "I didn't have anyone to turn to back then, so I get it if you don't want to talk." Maya's eyes flickered toward him just for a second, before returning to the floor. Caleb continued, his voice steady, though the memories still hurt. "I used to think being quiet was the only way to survive. If I didn't speak, I wouldn't get in trouble. If I stayed hidden, nothing bad would happen." The room remained quiet, but Caleb saw a small change in Maya's posture. She wasn't looking at him, but she was listening. He could feel it. "Sometimes," Caleb added, "being quiet is what gets you hurt the most." Maya blinked, her grip on the blanket tightening. "Where's your mom, Maya?" he asked softly, his heart pounding as he asked the question he feared most. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. But then, in the smallest, most fragile voice, she whispered, "She's gone." Caleb felt his chest tighten, but he kept his face calm. "Gone where?" Maya hesitated, her voice barely audible. She died?" The room seemed to shrink as Caleb processed her words. This little girl had lost her mother, and from the looks of it, she'd been alone for some time. He felt a surge of empathy for her, remembering the nights he had spent alone, wondering if anyone in the world cared. "I'm so sorry, Maya," Caleb said, his voice breaking slightly. "No one should go through that." For a moment, Maya said nothing. Then, as if the dam had broken, tears filled her eyes, and she began to cry. Quiet, soft sobs that shook her tiny body. Caleb felt a lump form in his throat as he watched her. He didn't reach out to comfort her. Not yet. He knew sometimes, You just had to let the pain out before anything else could happen. As the sobs slowly subsided, Caleb spoke again, softer this time. How long have you been on your own? Maya wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her worn-out sweater. Since she died. I tried to stay with a neighbor, but they didn't want me. And then I stayed at a shelter, but it was scary there. I didn't know where else to go. Caleb's heart ached for her. This little girl had been through more than most adults could bear. And yet here she was, sitting alone in his station, with no one to care for her. He leaned forward, his voice firm but gentle. You're not alone anymore, Maya. I know you're scared, and I know it's hard to trust, but I'm here. I'll help you. Maya looked at him through tear-filled eyes, her expression a mixture of doubt and hope. She didn't say anything, but Caleb could see that something had shifted between them. She wasn't just a scared little girl anymore. She was someone who, maybe for the first time in a long while, saw a glimmer of safety in the darkness. The following morning, the station was quiet as sunlight streamed through the windows, casting soft shadows across the room. Maya had finally fallen asleep on the couch, her small frame curled up beneath the blanket. Caleb sat at his desk, staring at the paperwork in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about what Maya had told him. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became, not at Maya, but at the world that had failed her. She was just a child, and yet she had been forced to carry the weight of something far too heavy for anyone her age. The system had let her down, just like it had let him down when he was a boy. Caleb had spent years trying to forget the pain of his own childhood, but now it all came rushing back. He glanced over at Maya, still sound asleep, and made a decision. He wasn't going to let her fall through the cracks like he had. He stood up and reached for his phone, calling a friend in child services. The conversation was brief, but Caleb knew what he had to do. The process of finding a safe place for Maya wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to see it through. He hung up the phone and sat back down, his mind racing with thoughts about what he could do to make sure Maya had a chance at a better life. A few hours later, Maya began to stir. She sat up slowly, blinking as she adjusted to the sunlight filtering through the room. Caleb gave her a small smile, trying to ease her back into the moment. "Morning, Maya," he said softly. "How did you sleep?" She shrugged, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Okay, I guess." Caleb nodded. "I made some breakfast if you're hungry. It's not much, just some toast and eggs." Maya hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. She followed him into the small kitchen area, where Caleb had set a plate of food on the table. She sat down, staring at the plate as if unsure of what to do. Caleb sat across from her, not wanting to pressure her into talking, but also knowing he needed to learn more about what had happened. After a few bites of food, Maya looked up at him, her voice small but steady. "What's going to happen to me now?" Caleb took a deep breath, leaning forward slightly. "I've been making some calls, Maya. There are people who want to help you, but it's going to take a little time. I'm going to make sure you end up somewhere safe. But for now, I want you to know you don't have to worry. You're going to be okay." Maya looked down at her food, pushing a piece of toast around the plate. "I don't want to go back to the shelter." Caleb's heart clenched. He had expected this, but hearing her say it out loud made it harder. "I know, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you don't have to." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the moment heavy between them. Caleb knew that finding the right solution for Maya wasn't going to be easy. He had already spoken to child services, and while they would do what they could, he knew how difficult it was to navigate the system. But as he watched Maya, he made a silent promise to himself. He wasn't just going to help her find a safe place, he was going to help her heal. He knew what it felt like to be abandoned by the world, and he refused to let that happen to her. Caleb finally broke the silence. "Do you have any other family, Maya? Anyone I could call?" Maya shook her head slowly. "No, it's just me." Caleb swallowed hard, the reality of her situation settling in. "Then we'll figure this out together." Maya looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "Promise?" Caleb met her gaze, his voice firm and sincere. I promise." Over the next few days, Caleb did everything he could to make Maya feel comfortable at the station. He knew it was only a temporary solution, but he also knew she needed time to feel safe again. The quiet moments in the station were filled with small, careful conversations, Caleb trying to coax more of Maya's story from her without pushing too hard. Maya remained guarded. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it was only a word or two at a time. Caleb could see the struggle in her eyes, the war between wanting to trust him and the fear that trusting would only lead to more hurt. He understood that fear all too well. One evening, after a quiet dinner at the station, Caleb decided to take a different approach. "Maya, do you like to draw?" he asked, pulling out a sketch pad and some colored pencils he had found in the storage room. Maya looked at the supplies hesitantly, then shrugged. "I guess." He handed her the sketch pad, giving her space. "You don't have to if you don't want to. But sometimes, when I couldn't talk about things, drawing helped me." Maya took the pad, her small hands tracing the edges of the paper. She didn't say anything, but after a few moments, she began to draw, slowly at first, then more deliberately. Caleb didn't press her, letting her focus on the task. He watched from a distance, giving her the freedom to express herself in her own time. After about an hour, Maya set the pencil down, staring at the sketch she had made. Caleb approached quietly, glancing at the paper. It was a simple drawing of a house, but the house was empty, the windows dark. Outside the house stood a figure, small and alone. Caleb's heart ached as he looked at the image. "Is that you?" he asked gently. Maya nodded, her eyes focused on the drawing. Caleb sat down beside her, trying to keep his voice steady. "That's a lot to carry, Maya. Feeling like you don't have a home anymore." Maya didn't respond at first, but then, in a voice so soft Caleb almost didn't hear it, she said, "I just want to go home. But I don't have one anymore." Caleb exhaled slowly, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I know it feels like that right now, but it doesn't mean you won't have a home again. Home doesn't have to be a place. Sometimes it's people who care about you, people who stick around when things get tough." Maya glanced at him, her eyes searching his face for something, maybe for the truth in his words. Caleb held her gaze, offering her the one thing she needed more than anything: reassurance. "I'm going to help you find that," he said. "A place where you feel safe. It might not be right away, but we'll get there. I'm not going to let you do this alone." Maya looked down at the drawing again, her fingers tracing the lines of the house. For the first time since she'd arrived at the station, she didn't look scared. There was still sadness in her eyes, but there was also something else, a small spark of hope. Later that evening, after Maya had gone to sleep, Caleb sat at his desk, staring at the files in front of him. He had spoken to several contacts in child services, but the options for Maya were limited. The foster system was overcrowded, and the shelters weren't much better. He knew sending her back into that system would be a mistake. Maya needed stability, something she wouldn't find in a rotating door of foster homes. Caleb rubbed his eyes, exhaustion setting in. He hadn't slept well in days, his mind constantly racing with thoughts about how to help Maya. As he sat there, a thought began to form in the back of his mind, one that made him both anxious and determined. Could he be the one to take care of her? The idea seemed impossible at first. He was a sheriff, busy with his work, and he wasn't exactly equipped to be a full-time parent. But then he thought about his own life, the loneliness he had felt as a child, the lack of someone who truly cared. He couldn't let Maya go back to that. He stared at the paperwork, the possibility of taking custody of her slowly becoming more real. It wouldn't be easy, but Caleb knew in his heart that it was the right thing to do. Maya needed someone who wouldn't give up on her, and maybe, just maybe, he could be that person. The next morning, Caleb felt the weight of his decision more than ever. As he watched Maya move quietly around the station, her small presence almost ghost-like, he realized how much she had already begun to affect his life. She still didn't speak much, but her silence no longer seemed like fear. It was more like the calm before something new began. Caleb knew he had to act. After breakfast, while Maya sat reading a book Caleb had found for her, he made a phone call. His voice was steady, but his heart raced as he spoke to his friend in child services again, explaining his thoughts, his intentions. "I've been thinking, Emily," Caleb said, his hand gripping the phone tightly. "Maya doesn't have anyone, and I don't think putting her back into the system is the right answer. I want to explore the possibility of fostering her myself." The silence on the other end of the line felt like it lasted forever. Emily finally responded, her tone cautious but understanding. "Caleb, this is a big decision. You know the process, and it's not easy, especially for someone in your position. But if you're serious, we can start looking into it." "I'm serious," Caleb replied, his voice firm. "I've thought about this a lot. Maya deserves more than being bounced around from home to home. She needs stability." Emily sighed softly. "All right, I'll start the paperwork. But it's going to take time, and there will be home evaluations, background checks, the whole thing. Are you ready for that?" "I am," Caleb said without hesitation. After hanging up, Caleb sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of what he had just committed to. He had always been dedicated to his work as sheriff, but this was different. This was personal. Maya had become more than just a case to him. She was someone he cared about deeply. That evening, Caleb decided it was time to tell Maya. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and he wasn't even sure how she would react. But she needed to know that someone was fighting for her, that someone cared enough to make a real difference in her life. After dinner, he sat down across from her in the quiet of the station. "Maya," he began, his voice gentle but serious. "I've been thinking a lot about what's next for you, and I want you to know that I've spoken to some people, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you don't have to go back to a shelter or be sent somewhere you don't feel safe." Maya looked up from her plate, her eyes wide but unsure. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly. Caleb took a deep breath. "I'm trying to become your foster parent. I want to take care of you at least for now until we can figure out something more permanent. But you'll stay with me, not with strangers." Maya's expression shifted slowly, from confusion to disbelief. "You want me to stay with you?" she asked, as if the idea was too far-fetched to believe. Caleb nodded, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I do. I know it might seem strange, but I've been where you are, Maya. I've felt alone, and I don't want you to feel that way anymore. You deserve a home. You deserve someone who won't let you go." For a long moment, Maya said nothing. Her hands fidgeted with the edge of the blanket she had wrapped around herself, her mind clearly racing with thoughts. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Why would you want to do that for me?" Caleb leaned forward, his gaze steady on hers. "Because I care about you, Maya. You're not just a responsibility to me. You're a person who deserves to be loved and taken care of. And if I can be that person, I will be." Maya's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. She looked down at her hands, then back at Caleb. "No one's ever said that to me before." Caleb felt his heart break a little at her words, knowing just how much pain lay behind them. "Well, I'm saying it now, and I mean it." Maya wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, sniffling softly. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll stay." Caleb felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't going to be easy, and the road ahead would be long, but he had made a promise to her, and he intended to keep it. In the weeks that followed, life took on a new rhythm. Caleb adjusted to his new role as a guardian, and Maya slowly began to settle into her new reality. At first, the transition was awkward. Neither of them really knew how to act around each other. Caleb had spent years living alone, and Maya had spent much of her life looking after herself. But bit by bit, the barriers between them started to fall. Caleb made sure to establish routines that would give Maya a sense of normalcy. Every morning, he would drop her off at school, and every evening, they would share a meal. Maya began to open up more, talking in short bursts about her day, about the things she liked, and sometimes even about her past. One night after dinner, Maya surprised Caleb by sitting down at the kitchen table with a pencil and a sheet of paper. "Can I help with dinner next time?" she asked, her voice quiet but more confident than before. Caleb smiled, taken aback by the question. Of course, Maya. I'd like that. Maya nodded, her small face serious as she began to sketch out what looked like a recipe. It was a simple moment, but to Caleb, it felt like a breakthrough. Maya was beginning to trust him, to see their new arrangement not as something temporary, but as a real home. Despite the progress they were making, Caleb knew there were still many challenges ahead. Maya's trauma ran deep, and it didn't go away just because she now had a safe place to sleep. At night, Caleb sometimes heard her crying softly in her room. She never mentioned it the next morning, and he didn't push her to talk about it. He knew better than anyone that healing took time. One evening, Caleb decided it was time to start a more serious conversation. He had avoided asking too many direct questions about her past, not wanting to push her before she was ready. But he needed to understand more about what she had been through. As they sat down to dinner, Caleb cleared his throat. Maya, I've been thinking about what happened before you came here. About your mom. Maya tensed slightly, her fork pausing midair. But she didn't shut down like Caleb had feared. She lowered her fork slowly and nodded, her eyes focused on the plate in front of her. I know it's hard to talk about, Caleb continued gently, but I want to help you, and to do that, I need to understand more. Can you tell me what happened? For a moment, the room was silent. Caleb waited patiently, not wanting to rush her. Finally, Maya spoke, her voice small but steady. She got sick, she began. It happened really fast. One day she was fine, and then she wasn't. Caleb listened quietly, his heart breaking for her as she recounted the events. I didn't know what to do, Maya continued, her eyes filling with tears. We didn't have anyone else. I tried to take care of her, but I didn't know how. And then she just died. I was all alone. Caleb reached across the table and gently took her hand. You don't have to carry that alone anymore, Maya. You did the best you could. And I'm so sorry you had to go through that. Maya nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. I don't like talking about it, she whispered. It makes it feel real again. Caleb squeezed her hand gently. I understand, but sometimes talking about it can help. It doesn't make the pain go away, but it can help you feel less alone in it. Maya wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her small frame trembling slightly. It's just hard. I miss her so much. I know, Caleb said softly. And it's okay to miss her. It's okay to be sad. But you don't have to go through it alone anymore. I'm here for you. Maya looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. That night, as Maya went to bed, Caleb sat alone in the living room, reflecting on everything she had told him. He knew that her grief wouldn't disappear overnight, but he also knew that the first step toward healing was allowing her to feel safe enough to share her pain. And for the first time in a long while, Caleb felt like he was finally making a real difference in someone's life, not just as a sheriff, but as a human being. The next few weeks passed in a blur of routines and small moments of connection. Maya's trust in Caleb grew stronger, though there were still times when she withdrew, retreating into herself when memories of her past resurfaced. Caleb had learned to give her space during those moments, trusting that she would come to him when she was ready. One afternoon, Caleb received a call from Emily at Child Services. He had been waiting anxiously for news about the fostering process, and when Emily finally gave him an update, it wasn't exactly what he had hoped for. Caleb, I've been reviewing your application, Emily began, her tone apologetic. And while I know how much you care about Maya, there are some concerns from the board. Given your work as sheriff, they're worried about the time commitment involved in fostering a child, especially one with Maya's emotional needs. Caleb's heart sank. He had anticipated some challenges, but hearing the concerns voiced aloud made the situation feel more daunting. I understand their concerns, but I'm committed to this, Emily. I'm doing everything I can to make sure Maya feels safe. I'm not just doing this as a temporary fix. I'm in it for the long haul. I know you are, Caleb, Emily said, and I believe that, but the process is complicated, and there are rules in place for a reason. You'll need to show that you can balance your responsibilities as sheriff with being a full-time guardian. Caleb rubbed his forehead, feeling the weight of the situation settle in. What do I need to do to convince them? There are options, Emily replied, but it's going to take time. You'll need to demonstrate that you have a reliable support system in place. People who can help when your duties as sheriff conflict with your responsibilities to Maya. You'll also need to attend parenting courses, and Maya will have to go through counseling. It's not impossible, but it's a lot of work. Caleb nodded, though Emily couldn't see him. I'll do it, whatever it takes. After hanging up the phone, Caleb sat in silence for a few moments. He knew this was going to be a long, difficult road, but he also knew he wasn't willing to give up. Maya needed him, and he wasn't about to let the system fail her again. That evening, Caleb sat down with Maya to explain the situation. She had grown more open with him in the past few weeks, but he could tell she still held on to the fear that everything could change in an instant. He didn't want to add to that fear, but she deserved to know the truth. Maya, he began, sitting across from her at the kitchen table. I need to talk to you about something important. Maya looked up from the book she was reading, her eyes wary. What is it? Caleb took a deep breath. I've been working with child services to officially become your foster parent. But there are some things we need to work through first. It's not going to be easy, and it might take a little while. Maya's face fell, her expression guarded. What does that mean? Am I going to have to leave? No, Caleb said quickly. I'm not going to let that happen. But there are some rules we have to follow, and I have to show them that I can take care of you the way you deserve. That means I'll need to take some classes, and we might need to meet with some counselors. But it's just part of the process. Maya stared at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with doubt. What if they don't let you? What if they make me go somewhere else? Caleb reached across the table and took her hand. I'm not going to let that happen, Maya. I'm doing everything I can to make sure you stay right here with me. But I need you to trust me, okay? This might take time, but I'm not giving up. Not on you. Maya looked down at their joined hands, her small fingers gripping his tightly. Okay, she whispered. I trust you. The following days were filled with meetings, paperwork, and more phone calls than Caleb could count. He enrolled in the required parenting courses, and Maya began seeing a counselor who specialized in helping children with trauma. The sessions were difficult for her at first, but Caleb saw a slow, gradual shift in her. She was beginning to heal, even if it was just a small step forward. At night, after Maya had gone to bed, Caleb would sit at the kitchen table, going over the paperwork and requirements that still needed to be met. The process was exhausting, but he knew it was worth it. Maya had come to rely on him, and he wasn't about to let her down. One night, as Caleb sat with a cup of coffee and a stack of forms, Maya appeared in the doorway of the kitchen. Can't sleep? Caleb asked, looking up from his work. Maya shook her head, her eyes still heavy with sleep. I was just thinking, she said softly, walking over to sit across from him. About everything. Caleb set the forms aside, giving her his full attention. What's on your mind? Maya hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. I've been scared for a long time, she admitted quietly. Scared that I'm always going to be alone. But with you, I don't feel so scared anymore. Caleb's heart swelled at her words. You're not alone, Maya. You never will be again. I promise. Maya nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of emotions, fear, hope, and something like relief. I believe you, she whispered. And for the first time, Caleb knew that no matter how hard the journey ahead might be, they would face it together. Weeks turned into months, and the routine that Caleb and Maya had established deepened into something that felt almost like family. The initial hurdles of the fostering process were slowly being overcome, though it still felt like they were always waiting for the next challenge to appear. Caleb continued his parenting courses, and Maya's counseling sessions seemed to be helping her open up little by little. But as life settled into this new normal, Caleb couldn't shake the constant worry in the back of his mind. Child services had been supportive but cautious. Their inspections were thorough, And though Caleb did everything in his power to meet their standards, he knew they were still scrutinizing every aspect of his life. It felt like his future with Maya was always hanging in the balance. One Friday afternoon, as Caleb was finishing up a report at the station, Emily called again. "Caleb, we've run into another complication," she said, her voice tired, as if she had been dreading making the call. Caleb's stomach twisted. "What now?" he asked, trying to keep his frustration in check. "There's been some interest from extended family," Emily explained. "A distant relative of Maya's mother has come forward. They're asking to be considered as her legal guardian." Caleb's heart sank. "What do you mean? Someone she's never met?" "Yes, a great aunt. She lives out of state, and while they haven't been in contact for years, legally, she could make a case." Caleb ran a hand through his hair, standing from his desk and pacing. "Maya doesn't even know this woman. She's finally starting to feel stable here. You can't just rip that away from her." "I understand, Caleb, I really do," Emily said, her voice filled with empathy. "But the courts have to consider every option, and family placement is often given priority. I'll advocate for Maya to stay with you, but it's not entirely in my hands." Caleb couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had worked so hard to give Maya a sense of security, and now it all felt like it could be taken away in an instant. "When will this be decided?" he asked, his voice tight. "There's going to be a hearing in a few weeks," Emily replied. "You'll be able to present your case, but I want to prepare you for the possibility that the family might win." Caleb's grip tightened around his phone. "I won't let her go. I won't." After hanging up, Caleb sat in his office, staring out the window, his mind spinning with anger and fear. How could a stranger claim Maya after everything they had been through together? How could anyone believe that someone who hadn't been there for her all this time was better suited to care for her? That night, when Caleb returned home, Maya sensed immediately that something was wrong. She had become attuned to his moods, just as he had become attuned to hers. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her eyes filled with worry as she sat at the dinner table, her fork barely touching her plate. Caleb hesitated. He didn't want to worry her, but he also didn't want to keep secrets. "There's something I need to talk to you about," he said gently, sitting down across from her. "It's about your future." Maya's face tensed, her eyes flickering with fear. "Am I going to have to leave?" Caleb sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. "There's a possibility," he said, his voice strained. "A relative of your mother's has come forward, and they're asking to be considered as your guardian. It's someone you've never met, a great aunt." Maya's eyes widened in shock. "What? I don't have any family." "I know," Caleb said softly, reaching for her hand. "But legally, the courts have to consider all options. That's why there's going to be a hearing. But listen to me, Maya. I'm going to fight for you. I don't want you to leave, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you stay here with me." Maya's face crumpled, her hands trembling as she gripped his tightly. "I don't want to go. I don't even know her. Please, Caleb, don't let them take me." Caleb's heart ached as he looked at her, seeing the fear in her eyes. "I won't let that happen without a fight. You're not just a responsibility to me, Maya. You're family. I promise, no matter what happens, I'll be right here fighting for you." Maya nodded, though her expression remained tight with worry. The uncertainty of the situation weighed heavily on both of them, and Caleb could feel the pressure of time running out. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings with lawyers, court appointments, and sleepless nights. Caleb did everything he could to prepare for the hearing, gathering evidence to prove that Maya's best interest was staying with him. He reached out to Maya's school and her counselor, hoping they could provide testimony to support his case. Maya, meanwhile, withdrew again. The progress she had made over the last few months seemed to unravel as the fear of losing her newfound home consumed her. Caleb tried to reassure her, but he knew she was struggling to hold onto the fragile sense of safety they had built together. The day of the hearing finally arrived, and Caleb felt a knot of tension in his stomach as he and Maya walked into the courtroom. The great aunt had flown in from out of state, a stern-looking woman in her 60s who barely glanced at Maya. Caleb couldn't help but feel angry at the idea that this woman, who had shown no interest in Maya's life until now, could be given custody. The hearing was tense, with both sides presenting their arguments. Caleb spoke passionately about the bond he had built with Maya, about the progress she had made since she had been with him, and about how he had committed himself to being her guardian. The lawyer for the great aunt argued that family placement should take precedence, even if the relationship had been distant. When the judge finally called for a recess to review the evidence, Caleb sat beside Maya in the waiting area, his hand on her shoulder. "No matter what happens, Maya," he said quietly, "I'm not going anywhere. You're not alone in this." Maya nodded, her eyes filled with anxiety. "I just want to stay with you." Caleb squeezed her hand, praying that the judge would see what he saw, that Maya's place was with him. The courtroom felt cold, sterile. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to echo loudly as Caleb and Maya sat side by side, waiting for the judge to return with a decision that would change their lives forever. Maya's small hand was tightly wrapped around Caleb's, and though she was trying to be brave, he could feel the slight tremor in her grip. The door creaked open, and the judge entered, taking a seat at the bench. Caleb's heart raced as he waited, his mind replaying the moments from the hearing earlier that day. He had done everything he could. Now it was out of his hands. The judge cleared her throat, her gaze scanning the room before landing on Caleb, then Maya, and finally the great aunt who sat across the aisle. "This has not been an easy decision," she began, her voice steady but firm. "We are tasked with considering the best interests of the child in cases like these, and both sides have presented compelling arguments." Caleb held his breath, his hand squeezing Maya's tighter. He could feel her trembling beside him. "While family placement is an important consideration," the judge continued, "it is also crucial that we consider the child's current situation and well-being. Maya has expressed a strong desire to remain with Mr. Thompson, and it is clear from the evidence presented that she has formed a deep bond with him." Caleb felt his heart skip a beat. Was this it? Was the judge siding with them? However, the judge added, "It is also important to acknowledge the legal rights of family members who wish to step forward and assume guardianship. Maya's great aunt has the legal right to petition for custody, but after careful consideration, I believe that removing Maya from the stability she has found with Mr. Thompson would not be in her best interest at this time." A wave of relief washed over Caleb, but he held his breath, waiting for the final word. Therefore, the judge concluded, "I am ruling in favor of Mr. Thompson's petition to foster Maya. The family may revisit the case in the future if circumstances change, but for now, Maya will remain in Mr. Thompson's care." Caleb exhaled, feeling the weight lift from his shoulders. Maya turned to him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Does that mean I get to stay?" she whispered, her voice filled with hope. Caleb smiled, his own eyes misting over. "Yes, Maya, you get to stay." Maya threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest as tears of relief streamed down her cheeks. Caleb wrapped his arms around her tightly, feeling the tension of the past few weeks finally melt away. It wasn't just a victory for them, it was the promise of a future together. Later that evening, back at the house, Caleb and Maya sat together on the couch, the glow of the fireplace casting a warm light over the room. The house had never felt so much like a home. "I was so scared," Maya admitted, her voice quiet. "I thought they were going to take me away." Caleb looked at her, his expression soft but serious. "I know, and I was scared too, but I promised you I wouldn't let that happen, and I meant it." Maya nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. "Thank you for fighting for me." Caleb smiled down at her, feeling a deep sense of pride and love for this little girl who had come into his life so unexpectedly. "You're worth fighting for, Maya. Don't ever forget that." For a moment, they sat in silence, both of them savoring the peace that had come after the storm. Caleb couldn't help but think about how far they had come, how Maya had gone from being a scared, lonely child sleeping in the back of a car to being part of his life in a way he had never expected. She wasn't just someone he was taking care of anymore. She was family. "I think your mom would be proud of you," Caleb said softly, his words carrying weight. "You've been through so much, and you're so strong." Maya looked up at him, her eyes shining with emotion. "Do you really think so?" "I know so," Caleb replied, his voice full of certainty. "And I'm proud of you too. Every single day." Maya smiled, a real, genuine smile that lit up her face in a way Caleb hadn't seen before. It was the kind of smile that spoke of hope, of healing, and of the knowledge that she was no longer alone. As the days turned into weeks, life settled into a new kind of normal. Caleb and Maya's bond grew stronger, and with each passing day, it became clearer that they had found something rare and special in each other. The fostering process continued, but now it felt less like a battle and more like a formality. Caleb knew that, no matter what happened next, they were in this together. Maya continued her counseling, and Caleb made sure to be there for her every step of the way. The nightmares still came sometimes, but they were fewer and farther between. And when they did, Maya no longer faced them alone. Caleb was always there, ready to reassure her that everything was going to be okay. One evening, as they sat down to dinner, Maya looked up at Caleb with a determined expression. "Can I ask you something?" she said, her voice hesitant. "Of course," Caleb replied, setting his fork down and giving her his full attention. Maya took a deep breath. "Do you think one day I could call you Dad?" Caleb's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, he was too stunned to speak. He hadn't expected that question, but when he saw the hope and vulnerability in Maya's eyes, he knew his answer without hesitation. "I would be honored if you called me Dad," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. Maya's face lit up with a smile, and in that moment, Caleb knew that they had found something more than just a guardian and a child. They had found a family. The days following the court hearing were a blur of relief and new beginnings. With the judge's decision in their favor, Maya's future with Caleb was secure for now. But the shadow of what could have been still lingered, a reminder of how fragile their newfound life together truly was. Maya clung to Caleb more in the days that followed, and though she tried to hide it, Caleb knew that the fear of being taken away hadn't fully disappeared. Caleb, however, was determined to show her that their bond wasn't temporary, that she was home for good. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a warm orange glow through the living room windows, Caleb sat on the porch with Maya by his side. She had become quieter than usual since the hearing, and though Caleb could sense her growing trust in him, he knew the uncertainties still haunted her. "Maya," he began softly, glancing over at her, "how are you feeling?" "Really?" Maya shifted in her seat, pulling her knees to her chest. "I'm okay," she murmured. I keep thinking about what would have happened if the judge had decided differently. What if she had sent me to that woman I didn't even know?" Caleb placed a hand on her shoulder, the warmth of his touch reassuring. "But that didn't happen, Maya. You're here. You're safe. And you're not going anywhere. I promised you that, and I meant it." Maya nodded, but her expression remained thoughtful, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I know. It's just hard to believe sometimes. I've never really had anyone keep their promises before." Caleb's heart ached at her words. He knew that her past had taught her not to trust, to expect abandonment at every turn. But he was determined to rewrite that part of her story. "I'm not like the people you've known before, Maya," Caleb said, his voice firm but kind. "You're stuck with me now whether you like it or not." Maya cracked a small smile, glancing over at him with a look that was equal parts affection and disbelief. "You really mean that, don't you?" "Every word," Caleb replied without hesitation. For a long moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the sounds of the evening settling around them. It felt peaceful, almost as if the world outside had faded away, leaving just the two of them in this moment of quiet understanding. Finally, Maya broke the silence. "I've been thinking about something," she said quietly, her voice tinged with hesitation. Caleb raised an eyebrow, turning to face her fully. "What's that?" Maya took a deep breath, her eyes flickering with uncertainty before she finally spoke. "I know you said I could call you Dad one day if I wanted to. And I think I'm ready." Caleb's breath caught in his throat, his heart swelling with emotion. He had waited for this moment, but he hadn't wanted to rush her. Hearing her say the words filled him with a deep sense of pride and love. "Maya," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "I'd be honored if you called me Dad." Maya smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Okay, Dad." The word hung in the air between them, and Caleb couldn't stop the tears that welled up in his eyes. It was a simple word, but it meant everything. It meant trust. It meant family. It meant that Maya, after all she had been through, finally felt safe enough to let him into her heart. Caleb pulled her into a hug, wrapping his arms around her tightly. "I love you, Maya, more than you'll ever know." "I love you too," she whispered, her voice muffled against his chest. "Thank you for everything." The next few months flew by in a whirlwind of new experiences. The legal process for Caleb's permanent guardianship of Maya went smoothly, and with each passing day, the fear of being separated faded further into the background. Their life together settled into a routine that felt, for the first time, like a real family. Caleb took her to school every morning, helped with her homework in the evenings, and they spent their weekends exploring the town, visiting the library, or going on walks in the park. Maya's confidence blossomed. She started making new friends at school and even joined the school's art club, discovering a love for painting that Caleb was happy to encourage. He often found her sitting at the kitchen table after school, lost in her drawings and paintings, a soft smile on her face. One evening, as they were cleaning up after dinner, Maya turned to Caleb with a shy grin. "Guess what? My art teacher said they're going to display one of my paintings in the school's art show next month." Caleb's face lit up with pride. "That's amazing, Maya. I'm so proud of you." Maya shrugged, though the smile on her face betrayed her excitement. "It's not that big of a deal. But will you come to the show?" "Of course I'll come," Caleb said, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." Maya smiled up at him, and in that moment, Caleb knew that they had found something special. It wasn't just about providing Maya with a safe home. It was about being there for all the little moments, the victories, the challenges, and everything in between. As the months turned into years, Maya and Caleb's bond only deepened. The nightmares of her past grew more distant, replaced by new memories filled with love, laughter, and security. Maya continued to thrive in school, and Caleb made sure to be there for every milestone, every parent-teacher conference, every soccer game, and every art show. Maya had found her place in the world, and Caleb had found his purpose in being her father. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, something they did often now, Maya leaned her head on Caleb's shoulder and sighed contentedly. "I'm happy, Dad. I didn't think I'd ever be this happy again." Caleb smiled, wrapping an arm around her. "I'm happy too, Maya. You've changed my life." Maya looked up at him, her eyes filled with the kind of love and trust Caleb had only dreamed of. "I think we changed each other." And in that moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a warm golden glow, Caleb knew that their journey, though filled with hardships, had led them exactly where they were meant to be, together as family.